Thank you very much, Samantha. That was very nice. I hope your studies go well. Without further ado, I'll start the talk. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ruth Vaughan. I'm based in Kenya. I'm talking from Naivasha today, and I'm going to talk about soil, the missing ingredient in conservation. Yep. Sorry, it's not moving to the next slide. So this talk is dedicated to my brother-in-law, Andre Silva, who recently passed away from cancer. And today would have been his 65th birthday. So here's to you, Andre. A bit about myself. I'm the technical advisory manager at Crop Nuts in Kenya. I was born and bred in Kenya, and I went to school in Kenya and Zimbabwe, and I went to university in Cape Town. In the last 25 years, I've been involved in sub-Saharan African agriculture, and I'm passionate about the soils, climate change, carbon farming, and how to improve soil husbandry and the livelihoods of farmers around us. Crop Nuts is the largest ISO-accredited sub-Saharan lab above South Africa, and we test hundreds and thousands of soil samples every single year. Excuse me. Our goal is to transform agriculture in Africa. And this is me. Let me just put my pointer on. So this is me, and this is what I do every day. I'm in a field of broccoli, and I'm in a hole in the ground. And basically, we dig these soil pits, and I look at the soil and how healthy it is, and the plant roots. And that's what I love the most. So from a soil scientist point of view, it all starts and ends with the soil. What is soil? Soil is the layer of loose mineral organic matter affected by physical, chemical, and biological processes at or near the planetary surface of the Earth, and it holds liquids, gases, biota, and supports plants. That's the basic definition of the soil. And you get poor soil, doesn't support any living organisms, and you get good soil. And the difference between the poor soil and the good soil is what makes us alive today. What we're asking in this talk is, has the soil reached its tipping point? It takes thousands of years to build decent soil. On average, you'll get about 1 centimeter of soil every 1,000 to 3,000 years, depending on where you are in the world. The making of soil is affected by the parent material, the rocks that it comes from, the topography, whether it's very steep or flat, the climate. So in Kenya, soils develop, we're a lot hotter, and soils develop much faster than in the colder climes. The organisms that live in and on the soil, and the time span. And soil is divided, is stratified. Basically, you get the topsoil that supports the living plants, subsoil that doesn't have a lot of living matter, living things in it, and then the parent soil at the bottom. Soil is comprised of about 5% organic matter, 25% air, 25% water, and 45% minerals. The topsoil, and that's the soil that holds all the nutrients and all the plants, is very fragile. It is estimated, and this is a figure that's rising quite rapidly, that 25,000 tons of topsoil are washed away every year. And if you look at our land, every year 2,000 million hectares of productive soils are degraded. That's horrific. And if you look even further into it, we're losing 5 to 7 million hectares of arable land completely. They just don't exist anymore. And when we look at the world and the population, the 2050 vision is to feed the 10 billion people that will be on the world, on the Earth in 2050. So to feed those people, between now and then, we have to at least double our food production. And the 10 million is a conservative estimate. It could go as high as 16 billion people. Africa's got 65% of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land. Are we the next global breadbasket? This puts a lot of pressure on Africa and our resources, and especially our conservation areas, because those are areas that have not been developed yet for human consumption. And to feed all these people, we're also confronted with climate change and soil degradation. So we have to reverse climate change and soil degradation in order to feed the world. So now let's look much more closely at the soil. 45% of the soil are the mineral particles that come from the bedrock. We can't change what mineral particles are in our soil. In a good soil, you'll get 25% air with oxygen and carbon dioxide that basically feeds the organisms in the, that oxygenates the organisms in the soil, and 25% water. And then we look at the most crucial part of the soil. Here is the organic matter. So in an optimum soil, you'll get about 5% organic matter, which is made up of 8% humus, 10% plant roots, and maybe 10% soil organisms. And this is the fraction of the soil that we control. And this fraction of the soil controls how much water and how much air the soil can store and how functional it is. So when we look at the 5% organic matter, which comprises of soil carbon, sorry, there's something in the way. This is the crucial bit of soil that we're looking at, the soil carbon. And it is the principal cause of soil degradation, and it is also a principal cause of climate change, soil carbon loss. So 2/3 of our terrestrial soil carbon has been lost from the soils and the vegetation in the, above the soils since the beginning of the 19th century due to soil degradation. An increase in just 1% of the carbon in our soils, in the top 1 meter of soils, could reverse climate change. The rangelands, so these are our grasslands in Africa, our rangelands, they contain 1/3 of the terrestrial carbon and they have the highest potential to sequester more carbon and to reverse climate change. So reversing land degradation and increasing soil carbon is the surest and lowest cost multiple win situation for saving our planet, and also for providing the agricultural soil that is required to produce the food that will feed all these people that are going to come onto this earth. Soil carbon is essential for soil aggregate formation. And here we have a very healthy soil aggregate that I've taken a photo of. And you can see that it's got cracks in it. It's all been held together. It's quite a strong, resilient soil. It's got cracks, it's got roots. And if you looked closely in the soil, you'd see soil organisms. And that is called a soil macro aggregate. And it's held together by the soil carbon. These aggregates are really important for the soil. If you have a soil that has no aggregates, this is a dispersed soil, and it rains, you can see that the rainwater hits the soil surface and forms a puddle on the top and will run off, and it doesn't enter the soil. Whereas a good aggregated soil that's got a nice crumb structure, when the rain hits the soil surface, it will filter into the soil and filter down and be stored in the soil. And if you look closely at a diagram of a soil aggregate, you can see you've got plant roots going through, you've got air spaces, spaces for water, you've got mycorrhizal fungi, and all sorts of things holding the soil together. So the soil carbon, which forms the aggregates, is important for the infiltration of rainwater into the soil and for the water holding capacity of the soil and for holding the nutrients that are so important for the plant growth in the soil. When we look at the soil, it is our most valuable ecosystem service provider. And if you look at soil health, it's responsible for the plant health, which is responsible for animal health, which is responsible for human health, environmental health, and at the end of the day, the health of the planet. So what does soil do? It grows our food, so it supports the plants, plant roots, it provides the nutrients and the water for growing our food. It stores and cleans water. Without soil, we would not have clean water. and we wouldn't have capacity to store water in the large amounts that we need for our day-to-day lives. Soil acts as a huge carbon and nitrogen sink, and carbon and nitrogen are the two gases, are the two biggest influences of climate change. Soil is responsible for holding and recycling plant nutrients. If you took away healthy soil, you wouldn't be able to hold the nutrients in the mineral, in the mineral layer that would support the plant growth, which ultimately supports animal health. Soil is invaluable for detoxifying pollutants. So in the soil, we've got hundreds and thousands of microorganisms that eat and digest pollutants that we as humans generate, and they digest them and turn them into reusable waste, basically. They recycle our waste. So a lot of the stuff that we throw away that is biodegradable, if you were to put it in the soil, it would degrade it and release the nutrients back to the environment in a form that they can be used again. Soil is invaluable at suppressing diseases. Now I'm talking about plant diseases, animal diseases, human diseases. Is all the microorganisms in the soil actually eat or outcompete or basically get rid of what we call the pathogens. And then soil is really important for structural support. We're looking at buildings and roads here. And then from a conservation point of view, soil is essential for habitat provision. When we look at the maps of Africa, let's go back 7,000 years. I don't know who was around to draw the map, but here's a map of Africa, and you can see some very well-developed river networks, some very large lakes, and a lot of forest land. So along the equatorial zone, you can see a lot of forest land, and then huge grasslands and savannas, and only a small bit of semi-desert and extreme desert down here on the bottom. When you look at Africa today, and here we have an FAO global status of human-induced soil degradation, we can see that, and these are the red areas, there are huge areas of very high, severe soil degradation. We have a lot of non-used wasteland. These are now deserts where the soil is degraded completely and it would be very difficult to bring back. And only a few areas where there is low soil degradation. If we take that map of Africa again, and on the right-hand side, we've got a map of all the national parks. So we can see the national parks are generally in areas where you've got a high severity of soil degradation. So there's good potential if we were to look after our soils a bit better, we would improve the holding capacity, basically, of the national parks. From a conservation point of view, now we're looking at the soil as an ecosystem. And underneath the soil, which not many of us look at very often, is a huge ecosystem called the soil food web. And it's essential for supporting and recycling. If you take the sunshine is the energy that drives the soil food web, and the sunshine shines on plants and they photosynthesize and they generate energy, which is turned into fats, carbohydrates and protein. And the carbohydrates on the top of the plants go into the soil via leaf litter, organic matter, root exudes. Root exudes are the most important, and that's called the first trophic level. And all this energy feeds the next trophic level, which comprises of the very small, tiny bacteria, fungi, and nematodes. And these in turn get eaten by arthropods, nematodes, and protozoa. And we carry on up to large nematodes and larger arthropods, which are eventually eaten by birds and animals. And this is a cycle that recycles all the nutrients and the energy that comes from the plants and the photosynthesis. In order to feed the living web under the soil, it takes, it's roughly enough food to feed 2 African elephants for 1 acre of soil to maintain a healthy soil. If we now go back to case studies on how humans have really degraded soils, one huge case study is the Texas Dust Bowl. On the left here, we have a gentleman holding natural savanna grassland plants, prairie plants, and you can see the root system is absolutely enormous and goes down a long way. What happened in the 1930s is that the prairies were ploughed up to produce wheat. And on the right, you can see the wheat growing. You can see that the root system is not very big and it's not going deep into the soil. So what happened is these lovely prairies that could support and hold loads of water and loads of plant nutrients were all ploughed up to grow wheat, which couldn't. And then what happened is the rains failed, so there wasn't enough rain to support the wheat. The wheat didn't grow, it died, and there was nothing to hold the soil together. And then after the droughts, where the soil surface was left uncovered and became very hot and dried up completely and generated windstorms, and the wind picked up the dust from the prairie surface and blew it around. And millions and millions of tons of soil were lost off the prairie permanently. The Texas Dust Bowl, I think it went on for about 10 years, and millions of people lost their livelihoods. A lot of people died of malnutrition and starvation. And to this day, so you're talking about the 1930s, 90 years later, there are still huge areas that were generated by the Texas Dust Bowl that have never been rehabilitated. Now I'm going to bring in a case study from Alan Savory, and if anybody's got time, Alan Savory's done a really good talk on TED Talks on how to green the world's deserts and reverse climate change. And if we go to the Masai Mara, for example, let's take the Masai Mara as an example. We have these beautiful grasslands that grow lovely like this after the rains and start drying up. This grassland must decay biologically and be returned back to the soil in order to feed the next crop of grass growing up. If you don't eat or remove this grass off the soil, what happens is it dries up, and here's some grass that's been left on the soil surface. It dries up, goes all grey, oxidizes and gets blown away and doesn't get returned, and the nutrients that were used to grow the crop doesn't get returned back into the soil in order to generate a new crop. And then what happens is all the soil gets washed away because there's nothing to hold it now, the roots haven't been fed, and the land degrades. So Alan Savory's got idea on how to green our world's deserts and reverse climate change, and using a mimicry of nature. So here we've got the wildebeest migration in the Mara and these beautiful grasslands. And if we mimic nature by bringing in our livestock, so for example, this field, if you take half of it and do some mob grazing, put in a lot of cows in a short time, do some mob grazing, what happens is the grass gets trampled onto the ground, it gets covered with urine and manure, and it gets squashed close to the soil, so that now all the nutrients from these plants can be returned back into the soil web so that they're available for the next growth of grass. Inside the soil, we have one of nature's little helpers called mycorrhizal fungi. And these are networks of fungi that grow in a symbiotic relationship with the plants. And in this diagram, we have a plant that doesn't have mycorrhizal fungi. And you can see that the roots have access to only a small amount of the soil. If you introduce mycorrhiza into the system and the mycorrhiza grows, what happens is the mycorrhiza takes the sugars from the plants. So the plant photosynthesizes, it sends sugars through its roots to feed the mycorrhiza, and in return the mycorrhiza rewards the plants with phosphorus, so minerals, phosphorus, zinc, water. And now suddenly this plant has got access to a much larger volume of soil, which means that it can grow quicker in drought conditions. And this picture I took this morning, and this is the driveway to my house. And these are candelabra cactus that I planted about 7 years ago. And on the left-hand side, these two candelabra were planted without mycorrhiza AMF fungus. And the two on the right were planted with mycorrhiza. And you can see the huge growth difference in the plants just because of the mycorrhiza fungi that are growing with the roots. And I gave this talk previously, and one of the questions are mycorrhiza useful in the desert? So I've had a bit of a look at the internet and done some revision. And in the desert, you get something called desert islands. And these are trees or slightly vegetated areas growing in the sand. And mycorrhiza play a really important role in desert plants. So if you hit, this is now not an African desert, sorry, but you've got your plant, your tree growing in the desert, and basically what it does is, as the wind comes along blowing dust and small organic particles, it captures the particles and drops it below its canopy. And underneath the canopy, you'll have smaller plants and possibly seedlings from those trees. If you add mycorrhiza into a desert system, they grow a very large mycelium on the soil surface, so that when these dust particles and small particles and the organic matter gets trapped by the tree, the mycorrhiza then helps digest and move the nutrients back towards the plant. Now, the mycorrhiza works in a very good way in the desert, is that from the sugars it gets from the tree or the plants, it produces a substance called globulin, which is very, very, very sticky. So as the dust particles get blown around, the mycorrhiza basically hangs onto it with its sticky exudes and makes sure that the topsoil stays in place. The mycorrhiza is really important for regenerating desert systems. This is a photo that was a video going around recently. So this is 2022, a few months ago, just before the rainy season in Kenya. And it's northern Kenya. And as you can see in the picture, before I start the video, there are no plants, there's no soil carbon, and there's no soil particles. So when the wind came along, it created this huge dust storm. And if you look at the people walking around, they're not very fazed. And the reason they're not fazed is they've never actually seen something like this before. Otherwise, they'd be absolutely terrified. So this is starting to happen now in Kenya, which is quite terrifying. And now I'm taking a case study from just up the road from me, because we get flooded every time it rains. So just up the road, we have a settlement called Karakta in Naivasha, Kenya. And I've taken some Google Earth photos. And in 2001, you can see that the Karakta settlement, there weren't a lot of houses. By 2021, nearly every piece of ground was covered with corrugated iron. So every time it rains, this corrugated iron, now all the rain runs off it and it's got nowhere to go because there are no ditches and it can't infiltrate into the soil. So it creates huge runoff and floods. And with the floods come a lot of water. So you can see this is actually on the tarmac road in Karakta. Every time it rains, we get floods full of mud. And this water ultimately runs into Lake Naivasha. This process is called urbanization and soil sealing. And if you have urban planning where there is no where the amount of runoff that's generated is not taken into account and ditches and things aren't put in place, you get a lot of flooding. And I think this is happening quite a lot this year in Pietermaritzburg, if I'm not wrong. This is another case study of soil degradation causing environmental disasters, basically. The Mai Maihu Road is the road that runs from Nairobi to the Mara. And uphill from the road, there is a lot of soil degradation. This soil is not fenced, it's not owned by anybody, it's free range grazing, and there's a lot of sand lorries. I don't know if you can see all these tracks and paths that generated. We can see informal settlements. So due to the overgrazing, and in some cases also there's places where the land is ploughed and it has no plants, and you see a lot of soil compaction. Every time it rains, basically, the area floods and it carries all the topsoil down towards the main road. And this is the main road. And this is a fissure that's being created from the runoff from this degraded land, because the water cannot infiltrate into the land and the land cannot hold or store any water because it's lost its soil aggregates, it's lost its porosity and its resilience. And you can also see that there's an awful lot of topsoil that gets washed down with these floods. And this is a problem that is costing Kenya billions of shillings, because every year they're having to fix these fissures that develop in the road due to the flooding. And then another very topical subject is the Rift Valley lakes. The water is rising, even though in the last few years we're running into drought situations. The water in the Rift Valley lakes is rising, and it's a bit of an anomaly. Why is the water rising? Here we have a Google Maps picture of Lake Baringo in 2001 and a Google Maps picture of Lake Baringo in 2021. And the surface area of the lake has increased dramatically. And if you go to the island, if you go to Lake Baringo, you can see that a lot of houses have been flooded and completely submerged due to the increase in the lake levels and therefore the surface area of the lake. If you go to the Lake Baringo Basin, worked out that the watershed is about 6,800 square kilometers. If we take into account that we've had a lot of erosion, excuse me, a lot of erosion in this area, and we lose 20 centimeters of soil draining into and we worked out the surface area of the lake, 130 square kilometers, how much would the lake rise? So due to the soil degradation around Lake Baringo, and the washing off of all the topsoil into the lake, the bottom of the lake has risen because of the sedimentation into the lake. And the other thing that's happened, excuse me, is the topsoil that washes into the lakes is filling up the bottom, and it's basically sealing it so that the water that is in the lake can't drain through into the subsurface, into the aquifers below. So the topsoil that's sedimented into the lake is trapping the water and preventing the recharge of our aquifers. So this is one reason why the water is rising. Another reason is thought to be tectonic plate movements. And the third reason is an increase in rainfall in certain areas. So if we go to Lake Baringo and look at photos, there's areas where we've got there's a lot of goats in Lake Baringo, and the soil is very fragile. It's arid land, and there's a lot of steep slopes. So overgrazing, and also now we have a lot of agriculture on the steep slopes, is creating a lot of land degradation and soil degradation. Here's a photo of Lake Baringo. This is Mrs. Roberts' house, all flooded. In Baringo and a lot of African areas around it, you get short, sharp showers. So you get a lot of rainfall coming down in a very short time, which also puts strain on the land, these heavy showers. and it enhances the loss of topsoil. And here we have a typical picture of the landscape around Baringo, where you've got a few island plants remaining in place where the roots have held the soil, and then the rest of the soil has been washed away. If we take this picture and look at the watershed area in Lake Baringo, and we estimate it at kilometers, let's say, which is 6.8 million square meters of soil. And if we look at the top 20 centimeters of topsoil alone, that can hold 25% water, and let's assume that 50% of this soil has been degraded and washed away, then what's happened is the amount of water that you can store in the soil, in the organic matter and the soil pores in this soil, has been washed away, and you've lost the storage of 17 million cubic meters of water. So potentially the undegraded soil could have held 17 million cubic meters of water more. What happens when it rains now is that this water is not stored in the soil, and it runs off completely and it goes straight into the lakes. So this is a huge amount of water storage that is lost in the soil, and this is the water that's required to grow the plants. So without the ability to hold this moist soil moisture in the dry seasons, then you cannot grow the biomass required to cover the soils again. You have to catch this water in some way. And this is the reason that we are getting a lot more floods in Africa, and especially in Kenya, because of soil degradation and the loss of the ability of the soil to store water. And then we're getting downstream from that, we're getting a lot of floods where the water just runs off the soil and causes environmental disasters. If we go very quickly into Teddy Bear Island. Teddy Bear Island is a little island in Lake Baringo, and this, in March 2011, here's a Google Earth photo of it. In March 2011, you can see there's a bit of agriculture going on, and you can see that they are goat boomers, basically. So the island had a lot of goats. When the goats were removed from the island, you can see that the island actually regenerated. So here's a Google Earth photo in August 2019, and we can see that a lot more trees have gone back. You've still got human habitation, but you've got loads of trees, a lot more grass, and they have moved from goats to agriculture. And if we go on the ground and look at a photo, here's a picture of Teddy Bear Island in May 2014. And here's a recent picture in September 2021. And you can see that there are a lot more trees coming back, and a lot more biomass and carbon is secured on this island. And on the island now you've got grass growing and a lot of grass seeds. So the inhabitants of this island have moved from surviving on the goats to making quite a large income from collecting the grass seed, which has been bought by NGOs to go and rehabilitate other areas in other places, degraded places in the area. So they're actually making quite a lot of money from their grass seed now. And the only reason this was possible was the exclusion of the goats, and also quite a few seed balls were thrown on the island to grow trees. If you look at the Loess Plateau in China, this was considered one of the world's most eroded areas. So you're talking about the beginning of the century, or even a bit before that, there was population increase and free land policy. So everybody living in the area could do what they want with the land. And very steep slopes, you can see lots of steep slopes and very fragile soils. And the land, because of the population pressure and people collecting all the firewood and growing annual crops that only had roots in the soil for 3 to 6 months a year, all the soil got washed away into the Yellow River. All the topsoil was lost. And this is in 1979, before land improvement was started, and you can see that they're adding contours into the land, and this is a little bit later where you can see the huge rehabilitation has taken place. The rehabilitation was started in 1979, funded by UNDP and the FAO, and it involved contouring, agroforestry, bringing in trees, permanent cropping, lots of permanent cropping, and now the land has regenerated and is much more productive, and it can support 70% more production on half the area, and it can support a much higher population. But this land degradation took a long time. So it's taken over 40 years and it cost a lot of money. The initial amount of money that was put into the project was $252 million in 1979. So that's worth millions these days. What we don't want to do is get land to the point where the degradation is so degraded that to cost us a lot of money and a lot of time. We don't have time to rehabilitate all these degraded lands. And these are just small examples of what we can do. So healing the earth with nature-based solutions. When the earth has lost its ability to store water and you get a lot of water runoff, we want to encourage as much water infiltration into the soil at point source as possible. So here are different projects. This is a project in Zimbabwe where they're digging little holes alongside their maize so that when the rain comes in, the water can infiltrate into these holes. And this is a river project in Kenya where underneath all this, there are a lot of holes, but also they're leaving all the organic matter on top of the soil to encourage water infiltration and to reduce the soil temperatures. And this is a project that I really, really love. And I think Johan had a look at it earlier. It's by a company called Just Dig It, and they build these earth smiles. This is in an area of Tanzania where it's been severely overgrazed in the past and it's lost all its topsoil. And you can see all these gullies and sheet erosion that's happening. And every time it rains, the water just runs off and therefore in the dry season, the soil can't support vegetation. So what they're doing is just manually digging these rills and holes in the ground in special, according to the contour basically, so that when the rain comes along, these smiles, they're called earth smiles, are catching the water and the water infiltrates in that area. Not only do they catch the water, but they're also catching any organic matter that happens to be around and any seeds that are on the topsoil of the area. So you can see that in 2018, they were just building the earth smiles, and in 2019, you can see that vegetation in quite a few of these has started to grow. 2020, a lot more growth, and you can see that the healing of the land is happening because the runoff is being slowed down and the water is being encouraged to infiltrate into the soil. So this is a really good example of how we can look at nature and find solutions to regenerate and regenerate our soils and reverse soil degradation. And this is just a quick photo. These are tools that we use in agriculture that would also probably be very useful in conservation. This is a Google Earth photo. I love Google Earth and I love looking at the different time zones. This is the Masai Mara, the game park's on the left, and on the right you've got a settlement, and you can see the road coming in and a gate where you go into the park. So that's your Google Earth photo. And then we use a tool a lot in agriculture called NDVI, and this enables us to have a look at the biomass, above ground biomass, and it's measured according to the colors. So if you look at the spectral here, the very dark blue is a high biomass, and the brown is the lowest biomass above the ground. And this is in January, I think January 22, before the rains, when the area was very dry, and you can see that the only biomass that's really left and the photosynthesis that's going along is along the rivers and in the forest area, the highly treed and forest area here. So that would be your dark blue. And then now we've got a little bit of rain and the vegetation's come up. So you can see the grass is growing, but you can also see the area. So you can see where you've got heavy pressure on the ground through settlement and through the cows, their cows and their animals, creating these compacted zones and paths where nothing can grow. So that's just a very quick lesson on NDVI. So how can we rebuild our soils? Initially, we need to monitor, so we can use Google Earth, NDVI, and what we do in crop nuts, our laboratory, is to measure the soil and to monitor the soils and to look at the organic matter in the soils and the nutrition and nutrients in the soils. So it's important to monitor so that we know where they've got to and how we can reverse, and if damage is happening or if improvement is happening. It's really important to protect our natural systems, our grasslands and our forests, and to encourage diversity. Diversity is supreme because with more diversity, you can build more biomass. And then grazing management. Soils develop in conjunction with herbivores. The herbivores break down the plant matter into pieces of plant that the soil organisms can actually digest. They also contain, the ruminants in their stomachs contain a lot of microorganisms that benefit the soil. So migrations and mob grazing are very good at utilizing the biomass in savannas and returning it back to the soil in order to enable regrowth for the next season. And then in areas where we don't have soil cover, we need to look at reforestation, agroforestry, perennial crops, perennial grasses, basically to keep the soil covered and living roots in the soil at all times, so that when it does rain, the water can go into the soil and be stored in the soil, and to hold the soil in place so that it doesn't get washed away by water and it doesn't get blown away by wind. And then it's important to limit the physical soil disturbance, because every time we're disturbing the soil, every time we're digging it up or moving it around or ploughing it in, we are basically burning off organic matter and we're killing the soil organisms that are in place, and it takes it a while to regain its balance. And then most importantly is also water management, to make sure that we plan our roads and our buildings and our ditches, and encourage water infiltration at point source so that we're not creating potential for environmental disasters, and that we can store the water where it falls and where it's required. And then landscape design is very important, to be able to channel the water or the wind in the right direction or to prevent it moving quickly, to cool soils, to cool the earth, and to try and reverse climate change. And I think that's all I've got for today. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much for this informative talk. And I'm excited to hear all the questions that people must have. And I just want to remind everyone, please use the reaction button at the bottom to raise your hand so that I can identify you, or you can use the chat box to ask any questions, and Ruth will be glad to answer them for you. So we'll be taking questions at this time. For me, I just had a question actually. So from the beginning of your talk, where you spoke about soil carbon in the soil and why it's important, I was wondering how soil carbon can be increased.
Oh, thank you, Samantha. So basically, with the mob grazing, you have a big increase in soil carbon. So when the grasses grow up and they're very high, all the carbon is held in the biomass above the soil. And then if you go through with mob grazing and you put that biomass close to the soil, then it will get absorbed by the soil food web back into the soil. That's one way of doing it. There's a lot of projects, and I love it too, is biochar. So to add biochar back into the soil, you're adding a stable form of carbon back into the soil. that greatly improves the water holding capacity of the soil. Basically, it's just to keep as many plants and plant roots in the soil as possible, and to keep those plants growing and to keep the whole cycle moving all the time. Yeah. And the mycorrhiza fungi, they are very important. They have a huge capacity to increase the soil carbon.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. We have Johan who's raised his hand. Go ahead, Johan.
Well, Ruth was reading my mind. I wanted to ask, how do you add the magic of mycorrhizal fungi to your soil? And yeah, please explain that. In anybody that's involved in agriculture, small scale, large scale, how do you do it in an organic matter, in an organic way?
Okay, so mycorrhiza fungi, they form relationships with plants, and you get certain species of mycorrhiza fungi that will join up with certain plants. There are a lot of commercially available strains of mycorrhiza fungi. In fact, when I worked for Dudutech, we used to grow quite a lot of mycorrhiza, but they won't always grow with the plants in your area. Ideally, what you want to do is to go and find a really good plant stand in your area with your plant type, and take the soil from below those plants and mix it in with your new soil. And hopefully that soil will contain the natural mycorrhiza from that area, and it will grow with the plant seedlings, and then it grows with the new plants. And that's how you recolonize the soil with the mycorrhiza. If you work the soil a lot and you break it up, turn it over, you're killing the mycorrhiza. And also if you apply a lot of chemical fertilizers like MAP, DAP, then it basically kills the mycorrhiza in the soil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So Ruth, just to a follow-on question, I'm just thinking, if I would be, say I have clay soil outside and I use a rich, more composted soil in where I grow vegetables, would that also be able to transfer those mycorrhizal fungi to the more composted soil? Would it grow, or would it not adapt? Does it make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, it makes sense what you're asking. So if you take the undisturbed soil, hopefully, that is full of microorganisms, the natural microorganisms, and you take some of that and add it to your soil that you've got lots of compost and your vegetables that you've been working over years, then in the undisturbed soil, I hope that there would be microorganisms that would be able to adapt to your vegetable plot and carry on growing. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan, for your questions. We have 2 questions in the chat from Murphy and Gina. I'll start with Murphy. And they write, interesting talk. Just to confirm, so it means that if good soil does hold water better than poor soil, then it also means that good soil helps control temperature fluctuations associated with climate change in the area? Let me know if you're, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yes. So good soil holds the water and it feeds the plants required to grow, to protect the soil and cool the soils down. So the good soil is hugely affects and reduces temperatures if it's got plants above it. Yes. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. They said temperature fluctuations associated with climate change in the area.
Absolutely, yes. So the better soils support more plants and hold more carbon, but when you're looking at the the microclimate in an area, as long as the soils are covered, then they're much cooler. And also, if the soils have got moisture in them, then they evaporate, and that also cools the soils. It's when the soils dry up completely that they become overheated.
Okay. Thank you, Ruth, for explaining that. And our second question is from Gina. She says, this was an amazing talk. Thank you, Ruth. Considering that students are in this talk, which field in soil science would you advise them to dig deeper for both agricultural and conservation purposes? Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Yes, considering that that I'm an agriculturalist and I'm trying to give a talk to conservationists, I think just general soil science would be great, yeah. But if we can transfer, if we can discuss between the disciplines, and we can learn a lot from conservation. Agriculture can learn a lot from conservation, and I would say conservation can learn a lot from agriculture. But to focus on soil science would be good.
Yeah, I think there needs to be dialogues between the disciplines. It's unfortunate that, you know, our disciplines don't discuss, you know, there should be an interdisciplinary, you know, I don't know, convention, conference, something for people to talk and to see the benefits of agriculture and conservation and how they can be married, so to speak. B2 says, very interesting presentation, Ruth. I loved it. I don't know how available will you be in future for further questions. We are working on land regeneration on a degraded land along a stream. I learned a lot for application on our project. So I think B2 is asking if you'd be available maybe for questions via email at a later stage, if they have questions for their project.
Yes, for sure. If they put their email, we capture these messages, don't we, Samantha?
I believe so. I believe the messages are also captured.
Ruth, may I ask you, you referred to the potential of rangelands to mitigate climate change. Can you maybe just expand a little bit in comparison with forests? Because we always are looking at forests for, you know, plant trees. Nobody says, nobody's ever saying plant grass.
And you're very right. So everyone focuses on the forests and the trees in the forest because what they're looking at what they can see. And in forests, the biomass and the carbon is stored above the ground. So it's very susceptible to, for example, fires and droughts and all sorts of things. Forest soils tend to be at the top in the water towers, and the soils tend to be very shallow and don't hold a lot of organic matter. And one of the reasons is that they've slowly gone down to been washed down to the lower lands. Savannas and the rangelands and the grasslands, the soil is very, very deep. So the amount of soil, the depth of the soil and the volume of the soil is much larger. And also the biomass is below ground. So you've got a huge biomass and a huge carbon store below the ground that is much more stable and protected. And there's a huge potential in these degraded lands to build the carbon levels up again and capture huge amounts of carbon. So much higher ability in the rangelands to capture carbon than in the forests. But you can't do it without water. So that's why you need the infiltration, like the just dig it smiles to get the water into the ground to grow the plants. Yeah.
That was a fascinating piece of information, because then arguably a lot of people are going the wrong way around in trying to combat climate change, because everybody's focusing on the forests, and you have one fire sweeping through and all that carbon that's been retained has been removed back into the air, whereas the grasslands will actually hold it, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, the grasslands can hold it. And at the moment, the grasslands are a much huger area if you look at the Earth's surface.
Yes.
I think when it comes to growing any plants for climate change, we have to do every single thing we can. So we need to focus on the forests and the savannas. But what people don't understand, I think, a lot is that the rangelands have such a big capacity to capture carbon and reverse climate change.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ruth.
And thank you for that question, Johan. We have a question from Peter Bota. I've asked to unmute you. You can go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
I'm Peter Bota. I work for the Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa, and we've got quite a big land scale project specifically looking at increasing carbon in conservation areas, improving that. And the previous question regarding carbon in rangeland or grasslands or veld in South Africa as we know it, compared to forested areas. And I also like to use the analogy always that when grass plants were created, they were created with three things in mind. that will definitely happen to them. They will either freeze to death or frost to death. They will either be eaten off or they will burn off. If you're from the Free State, you will know it's a fire-driven or fire climax regime happening in no grasslands there. And grasses had to adapt for their survivability by storing their carbon below ground level in the soil. Whereas in a forest, the biggest competitor there, and the one thing, if you think back to the presentation, was sunlight. That is the biggest driver in this whole process. Trees in a forest have to compete with each other to get to the sunlight. So they push their carbon production into their stems and the branches to reach the highest level to capture that sunlight. And none of that carbon goes below ground because fire never used to be a problem in a forest. A forest is a high moisture driven area. There isn't a lot of material fuel load underneath. The canopy is high enough that even if you do get a fire, the canopy is normally not disturbed. So therefore, and that's why the grasses are so effective in driving this whole carbon thing within the landscape and the restoration. One critical thing that we should not lose sight of, and that is happening in quite a few projects around the world, where people has latched onto a specific species for its ability to capture carbon or sequester carbon within the soil. But they lose sight of the whole biodiversity principle. Veld or grasses did not develop in isolation. That whole plant succession process that happens with the interspecies dependability on each other to sequester carbon is not going to happen if you take a field and you simply plant speckworm, for instance, in a field and think you are in the process of sequestering carbon. That plant cannot function in isolation. It is completely needs the support of other plants, other vegetation, other microbes in the soil around it to support that whole process of the interchange between the carbon in the grass's roots and moving into the soil. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to respond, Ruth?
Oh, no, I totally agree. Thank you very much, Peter. That was absolutely brilliant. And a very good analogy, I think. It helps us understand the whole process much better. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. We have another hand raised from UFS. But just before that, I just wanted to acknowledge the questions in the chat from Gina and Hanneline. Gina says, do you perhaps see yourself starting a mini agricultural school or center in your region for future generations? Because we have to admit that you have a lot of knowledge to share with the youth. It's a very good question.
Oh, Gina, that's very kind. We actually, through Crop Nuts, we have a Crop Nuts campus and we do a lot of training. In fact, I'm sort of heading the training unit. So everybody's welcome to the Crop Nuts campus. So we do training on soil health, regenerative agriculture and organic carbon, soil carbon, that sort of thing, as well as just your agricultural courses.
Mm. And where is this campus based?
We're in Limuru, Kenya. Everyone's welcome to Limuru, Kenya.
Thank you, Ruth. And we have a question from Hanneline. And the question is, hi, Hanneline from the University of the Free State. Do you work in collaboration with zoologists and entomologists to study and describe any of the soil animals, or maybe study the succession of these organisms during the regenerative process?
So, Annaline, sorry, we mainly have in the past years been focusing on the chemical, physical, and not so much the biological properties of the soil and the macrofauna. But I am doing at the moment, I'm doing a soil microbiology course. I bought myself a microscope and I look at the soil and I'm looking at the macro and microfauna in the soil. But we don't concentrate on it in our business so much. It's more in the conservation areas. It's a huge area of growth at the moment and they are learning new things all the time. I hope that answers your question, Annaline. Thank you.
And thank you for answering the question. Do we have any more questions from the room or from the classroom? I don't see any hands either from the classroom or within the Zoom meeting. Peter in the chat writes, the US has developed a soil DNA process. I think in response to what you just said, Ruth.
Yeah, and we do send soil off to be measured for their DNA. There are labs in South Africa. There's labs in Europe and the US that look at the soil DNA and classify it. So, and that's a soil science area that's developing very fast. So thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for that question. Do we have any more questions? I don't see any more hands. Ruth, would you like to end with any closing remarks? Oh, we have one question, sorry, just before, or not. Someone had raised their hand and they put it down. Do you have any closing remarks, Ruth?
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining this talk. It's been a pleasure. I see there's quite a few faces from Kenya that I know, so thank you very much. And I think everybody, when you look around, I hope you look at the soil with new eyes, and let's all work together to protect the soil. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk.